Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the public webinar series at Tokyo College Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Tokyo. My name is Naoko Shimazu, and I'm professor and deputy director at Tokyo College, and also a global historian and moderator for today's session. So now allow me to introduce today's panelists. Our speaker today is Professor Sebastian CONRAD, who is the chair of modern history at the Freie University of Berlin. Sebastian is a prolific author who is very well known for many contributions to the writing of history, but perhaps one of the most famous ones is the publication of his What is Global History? From the Princeton University Press in 2012, and since then translated into 12 languages. But not many of you might know that Sebastian CONRAD started out as a historian of modern Japan. And that was when I first met him at the Institute of Social Science, Shaken, at the University of Tokyo in the 1990s when we were both young. He is currently working on a topic provisionally entitled Shaping the Body in the Global Age. So today's talk is based on his book publication in German, and it's The Queen, the Global Career of Nefertiti, available only in German at the moment, but this will be published from the University of Chicago Press next year. So we very much look forward to this English publication. Now, to comment, we have Lucy RIALL, who is at the Department of History and Civilizations of the European University Institute in Florence. She is visiting the National Museum of Ethnology until the end of this month. She is a global historian of Europe and specializes in Southern Europe, or has written a lot about Southern Europe, but now also Latin America as well. And having authored books on the Risorgimento, Sicily, and most relevantly for today's discussion is her Garibaldi, The Invention of a Hero, the 2007 publication from the Yale University Press. She has worked extensively on the relationship between masculinity and politics in the 19th and 20th century Europe, and with particular reference to the development of leader cults. Hence, a perfect commentator for Sebastian's talk. For those of you in the audience, at Tokyo College, we are currently trying out different formats of our webinar series. So today's session will be 60 minutes in total, starting with the 20-minute presentation by the speaker, and followed by 5 or 10 minutes comments from Lucy RIALL to kickstart our panel discussion. And then, of course, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of the, so closer to the end of the session. So before we start, I'd like to draw your attention to the availability of the simultaneous translation. Please click the translation button at the bottom of the screen in order to switch to Japanese or English. Today's session will be conducted in English. Now, for the Q&A session, please post your questions in English or Japanese in the chat box on the screen. So, without further ado, Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. This is building on the book that Naoko kindly mentioned. The Nefertiti is obviously an ancient Egyptian queen, long time ago, but in many ways she's really very present. In 2018, Beyoncé, the famous singer-songwriter, she appeared as Nefertiti at the Coachella Music and Arts Festival in a Nefertiti dress with the characteristic headgear that where she impersonated Nefertiti as a symbol of female regal power and also of Black beauty. Beyoncé was fascinated with Nefertiti. She produced a whole clothes collection with Nefertiti images. She traveled together with her husband to Berlin to see the famous Nefertiti bust in person. And before that, she also had traveled to Egypt, where she wanted to see the original sites. In Egypt, she was led around by Zahi Hawass, the director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. And the two of them, they shared some views, namely, in particular, to the idea that that Nefertiti was not, certainly not, a European piece of art. It was not part of the European tradition, but they both, in some ways, went against the colonial narratives that Western Egyptology had produced for so long. At the same time, they didn't really hit it off. Zahi Hawass thought that Beyoncé was rude, and he essentially kicked her out of the country. But the fallout was more than simply the fact that two individuals didn't get along. Instead, it pointed to deeper conflicts between them. Namely, for Beyoncé, Nefertiti was essentially a black figure, a figure of the black African and African-American tradition, while for Zahi Hawass, it was different. He certainly was of the opinion that Nefertiti had nothing to do with Europe, but also, in his words, not with Africa. She belonged solely to the Egyptian tradition. And in some ways, we'll come back to this contentious issue. This is something that has accompanied the debate about Nefertiti across the past century. So I'll be talking about now about the ways in which the bust of Nefertiti in the 100 years of its public existence has become a global icon appropriated by different groups around the world with vastly divergent and different purposes and positions. Briefly, just as a background, the bust was excavated and found in 1912. This is a picture of that moment, excavated by Ludwig Borchardt, the leader of the German delegation. He was an Egyptologist who was immediately, when he saw the bust, he was immediately fascinated. He immediately knew that this was something particularly striking. You have to, this is from his diary, there's no need, there's no use describing it, you have to see it, he wrote. And he knew that ultimately it would have to remain in Egypt. And this is where we come to the so-called division of finds. Because in 1912, Egypt was still technically a province of the Ottoman Empire, but for all intents and purposes, it was really a colony of Britain. So we're talking about a colonial situation with several layers, actually, of colonial hierarchies. Namely, the Antiquities Service was not run by the British, but by the French. And so it was ultimately a French officer that came to the site of the excavation to negotiate the division of finds. Division of finds essentially means that at that time, the campaign that funded and also, did the excavations, they were allowed to keep half of the finds. The other half would remain in Egypt. Now, why exactly the bust of Nefertiti ended up in the German half is a contentious issue up until today. We can go into this later. It's very difficult to understand completely, but in the end, Borchardt was able to secure the bust for his sponsor, James Simon, a Berlin philanthropist who had sponsored the excavation. Now, for 12 years, the bust remained hidden. Borchardt made clear, because he was afraid that as soon as it was becoming public, the Egyptians would claim restitution. And he was quite right. So it was only in 1924, so pretty much exactly 1 century ago, that the bust was exhibited for the first time. Very briefly, who was Nefertiti? She was an ancient Egyptian queen. She was the wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten. But she was more than simply a spouse. She was really a very powerful figure. And the two of them were responsible for what is usually called a cultural revolution in ancient Egypt. The main point would be that they abolished the many gods and transformed Egypt from a polytheistic society into a monotheistic society. This is what is sometimes called the Amarna Revolution. They created a new capital in Amarna where they venerated and worshipped the new god, the sun disk. In the words of the American Egyptologist James Breasted, thus dawned a new age in which Akhenaten and Nefertiti brought monotheism centuries before it appeared anywhere else. This is a perspective that was then later made famous by Sigmund Freud. So monotheism, and we see here in this famous image, we see the two, Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and then the sun disk with its sun rays as the symbol for this one deity. Not only that, also there was a second dimension that scholars praised, namely, and we're again with James Breasted, Akhenaten, according to him, became the world's first idealist, the first individual in world history. Now, that's maybe a bit of an overstatement, but essentially, if we look at monotheism, individual, we see that at the beginning of the 20th century, Europeans and North Americans saw in Amarna the origins of modernity. And we'll come back to that point in a moment. Now, 1924, the bust is exhibited for the first time in Berlin. Here is an image. And it became immediately a celebrity, both with the Berlin public, with the larger German public, but also beyond Germany. Within a short period of time, copies were made and exhibited in museums in Britain, in the United States, and elsewhere. And this is the age of photography. Pictures circulated around the world very quickly. Now, there is a lot that can be said about the reasons why this image, this figure, became so popular so quickly. Let me just briefly refer to one of them, which is that Nefertiti fit the very specific ideal of femininity in the 1920s in particular ways. So this is the moment when Greta Garbo began, her stardom began. And for many observers, Nefertiti was sort of a Greta Garbo of ancient Egypt, right? So had she appeared, let's say, 100 years earlier, it's very unlikely that she would have made the same impression on the larger public. Now, within very brief time, she became a symbol, an icon that could be used for all kinds of things. All kinds of expectations, hopes, and purposes were projected upon her. Of course, in the field of, of course, we would say today, in the field of cosmetics, any kind of beautification product. In fact, even today, there is anyone who's into cosmetic surgery, there's a Nefertiti lift. But it was not only her beauty, she was used for all kinds of other purposes, like, advertisement for all kinds of things. This is an advertisement for tobacco, as just one example. She was appropriated very early on by feminists. The New York Times called her not only a modern woman of the 14th century before Christ, but also as the world's first feminist. The Weimar Republic Social Democrats used her image, as did, interestingly, the Nazis, right? There were, in the 1930s and 40s, several novels that praised Nefertiti essentially as an Aryan, even if that's hard to believe. So while these Nazi novelists wrote their Nazi fiction in ancient Egypt, Thomas Mann, in his exile in Pacific Palisades, wrote his large novel, which essentially used Amarna as a site of, if you will, democratic hope against authoritarianism. In the Federal Republic, after the end of World War II, people flocked to the exhibitions that where Nefertiti, where the bust was exhibited. And as you can see in this image, one can see the hunger for the, should we say, I mean, for the beauty, the aesthetic purity after these years of war and dictatorship. And since then, Germans have continued to look at Nefertiti and see themselves in her. Well, in 1989, Germany, if you will, put an official stamp on its claim to ownership of the bust. So it really has become part of the German identity, cultural identity, if you will. Of course, the same is true for Egypt. Nefertiti has a long history of in Egypt itself. It's important to remember, though, that up until the late 19th century, ancient Egypt didn't really play a huge role in Egyptian debates. Up until that time, the ancient civilization was more or less seen as a pagan episode far in the past before Islam came along, unrelated to Egyptian present. And as Eliot Koller and others have shown, it's only at the end of the 19th century that ancient Egypt really becomes an integral part of Egyptian nationalism debates about Egyptian identity. But then it does so with a vengeance. And if we go into the 20th century, for example, the period of Nasser, we see that, you know, what the Germans do, the Egyptians they can do as well. This is actually one of my favorite images here. It's from the Nasser period, early 1960s. It's you know, the sewing machine is a symbol of modernity. It's a symbol of this modernization from above, an autocratic modernity that nevertheless reaches deep into society. There's clearly a gendered aspect here, as you can imagine, and the marriage of hypermodernity, this machine that can do something that people forever had to do with their hands, and then Nefertiti, meaning ancient Egypt. This marriage becomes quite visible in this in this image. Now, for the most part, ancient Egypt was used to prop a regime that was, for the most part, fairly authoritarian. But in the period of, but there are also other appropriations of Nefertiti, like this one in 2012. This is the time of the Arab Spring, when the artist El Zeft put this graffiti up in Mohammed Mahmoud Street, close to Tahrir Square. So we see that Nefertiti can be used, and it's also used by feminist groups, for example, in Egypt, can be used by different constituencies. These days, however, it is again used by the government. This is President Sisi's large 1921 golden parade of the pharaohs that again marries ancient Egypt and present-day Egypt. And this is himself. This majestic scene, he says, is a testament to the greatness of the Egyptian people, the guardians of this unique civilization that reaches into the depth of history. Now, Germany, Egypt, but there is a broader story here that goes beyond these two countries. And this is linked to the way in which Egypt, ancient Egypt, increasingly became an element in narratives of modernity. Increasingly, from the 19th century onwards, that is, Europeans projected the beginnings of their modernity, not only to Rome and to Greece, but even further back to Egypt. And in the imperialist times, this narrative was projected into the world. And this is one of the reasons why references to ancient Egypt pop up around the world in places that we might not expect. We might expect African appropriations, right? This is Nelson Mandela, who in 1962 traveled to Egypt. This was before he was confined to Robben Island. And in Cairo, he said, I discovered that Egyptians were already creating great works of art and architecture when whites were still living in caves. In other words, we Africans had civilization first. Now, the fact that civilization began in Egypt was not lost on many others. So in the 19th century, interestingly, many politicians, statesmen, intellectuals, reformers traveled to Europe to learn about European modernity. And where did they make their first stop? Right, in Egypt. This is the first Japanese delegation. This is 1864, when a Japanese delegation to Europe stopped in Egypt, the cradle of civilization. The first Chinese delegation came only 2 years later. Rabindranath Tagore traveled twice to ancient Egypt. The Brazilian king, emperor in fact, Pedro II, saw himself as an Egyptologist, traveled to Egypt twice, and we see him here in this picture. So one strategy, in other words, by aspiring countries aspiring to modernity, was to actually begin their study of Western modernity right here. The second strategy was to claim links to ancient Egypt in the deep past, to indicate that one's own culture was actually linked to Egypt and hence had the potential for modernization. And this is a strategy we can observe in many places here. Just a few examples. In Mexico, for example, intellectuals claimed that the pyramids, like the one here in Teotihuacan, were the result of direct links between Mexico and ancient Egypt. In China, scholars claimed that the Chinese script was actually derived from the Egyptian hieroglyphs. So in other words, these are ways in which different constituencies tried to link their own story to ancient Egypt. And most prominently, this happened among African Americans. This goes back, way back into the 19th century. Here is the example of Martin Delaney, who also traveled to Egypt himself. And when he was there, felt that he had a peculiar heritage in the Great Pyramid. The blood, he wrote, seemed to flow faster through my veins. I seemed to hear the echo of those illustrious Africans. And we can see Egyptians are Africans, and African Americans are heirs to this tradition, right? And this is a tradition that, you know, we have many more statements of W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, other African Americans who fall in that tradition. And then in, you know, more recent days, it has found many echoes. This is, some of you may remember the video to Remember the Time by Michael Jackson, where we have Nefertiti right here. It's important to realize that this African-American appropriation is really a stark contrast to earlier appropriations, right? We'll go back to James Breasted, who wrote, Egyptians are members of the white race, separated from the teeming black world of Africa, right? The European and North American view for the longest time was that the Egyptian civilization could only have been white. It was unimaginable that it was African. So to claim this as African heritage is quite a strong and stark statement. It also differs dramatically from someone like Zahi Hawass, who would say that the origin of ancient Egyptians was purely Egyptian. The ancient Egyptian civilization did not occur in Africa, it occurred only here. So we see that this issue of race and how to interpret and who is allowed to appropriate Nefertiti is a contested issue. And I'll come back to that in a second. Now let me conclude. There's Along, you know, there's much that can be said here. I have not even touched the issue of restitution, but I want to make two sort of concluding statements here, because in the story that I've been telling today, I see what can be described as a double shift in the logic of the way in which this figure has been appropriated. A shift that tells us a lot about the way in which debates about the role of culture in globalization has changed as well. The first shift is this. So in the early 20th century, Nefertiti was discovered, exhibited in an age of European imperialist hegemony. Right? That is, the iconic power that this bust acquired was also due to the power of European empires. Now, today, we live in a different age, and for that reason, given the cultural hegemony of North America, debates that happened in the United States have also been propelled around the world. And this is particularly true for the notion of race. And the interesting, if you will, paradoxical effect is that a reading of Nefertiti as Black, which was initially sort of an anti-imperialist move, an anti-Western move, if you will, has now become a globally disseminated discourse, particularly through the power of American pop culture. And it comes now with the power of the geopolitical position of the United States. So in other words, it's anti-Western, but it's, you know, it comes with the full force of Western hegemony in its new guise. The second shift is that we have also moved from, now these are shorthands, right? This is a schematic sketch here, but we've moved from an imperial to a global age. And by that I mean the following. So when Nefertiti was discovered, the leading ideology of the times essentially was the civilizing mission. So European and North American countries had developed, they had civilized, and through the means of colonialism, they would gradually help everyone else to civilize as well. In other words, this idea of civilization was a strategy to claim that differences would sooner or later all disappear. The disappearance of difference is no longer on the agenda. In this, our global age, which is no longer driven only by the power of empire, but also of corporate power and the markets, the difference itself is no longer necessarily something that will disappear, but in fact, it can be celebrated. And we see this also in the case of Nefertiti. So just, you know, let's look at two covers of the magazine Vogue to see what this actually means. So this is a 1964 image of Audrey Hepburn as Nefertiti. This is, if you will, an example of the white European appropriation of Nefertiti, so different from the 2018 cover in which Rihanna dresses up as Nefertiti. Now displaying the power not only of Western empires, but also of diversity. I'll conclude with the following observation. Today, Nefertiti remains contested between so many different constituencies and interest groups, but the interesting thing is the following. It's not only the property of the bust, the debate about restitution that is that is at the heart of these debates, but it's also the interpretation. Who has the right to speak for Nefertiti, if you will? And the best example of this, and this is my final slide, is the exhibition in the museum in Leiden in the Netherlands in June 2023. This is an exhibition that showed how pop music, in particular hip hop, rap, jazz, mostly African-American artists appropriate and use Egypt in their lyrics, in their videos, in album covers, and so forth. Now, this did not go down well in Egypt with the Egyptian public, and also official positions in Egypt, who felt that this was an illegitimate appropriation of Egyptian cultural heritage. And in response to the exhibition, they banned Dutch archaeologists to continue to excavate in Egypt, which they had been done uninterruptedly since 1976. This example shows how contested this image is, more so even, I claim, than the physical property of the bust. Thank you for listening.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sebastian CONRAD, for the most fascinating, multifaceted analysis of Nefertiti's famous bust. And now we move to Lucy RIALL, who offers some comments.
Okay, I'll be quick because I want to hear questions. Thank you, Sebastian. That was actually really interesting. I mean, because you've condensed actually a very complicated story with an awful lot of different participants into something very succinct and clear and incredibly interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that I got out of it was a kind of history of fame, how fame works through particularly cultural artifacts, in this case, in a way, an archaeological artifact, and what the fame of a cultural artifact can tell you about politics, and what it can tell you about kind of broader cultural and even geopolitical change, because that's what you ended with. I also was kind of fascinated, and I mean, I think we all want to read the book now, having heard this. But I really like the way that you moved, actually, really quite seamlessly, and that's not easy, between sort of an archaeological scholarship, if you like, and at least at the time in the 1920s, 1930s, a serious intellectual discovery and pop culture. So ending with that kind of strange image, I have to say, from Leiden, it slightly worried me too, but that may say something about me. So I think this is wonderful, and I wish we had more time, and I hope there will be more time to talk about this. But I have just but there were kind of one or two things I wanted to bring up, and before we throw it open. First of all, is actually about this issue of whiteness, and you said, or Naoko said, that this work that you're doing on Nefertiti is actually also about kind of the Western body and so on. And it's not that I disagree with you, but I wonder, in a way, two different but related things. First of all, and this is a question, to what extent was this image of Nefertiti, this kind of as a white woman, contested actually at the time? So I'm thinking, I mean, I see that you talked about Germany, and I can see that that's very clear. But kind of elsewhere, this juxtaposition that you argue exists between sort of whiteness and blackness, and you posit it very much as obviously in the time available, as a kind of contestation between, in the latter case, Black America and kind of white America, if you like. I wonder if it is actually as simple as that. So it's kind of an invitation for you to say a bit more about how that really works. Also because, and I'm going to say this, so forgive me, but it seems to me that you talk a lot about sort of the Anglo world in Germany. But of course, I wonder about the reception of Nefertiti in the Mediterranean, in Mediterranean countries, which have a kind of different, perhaps just as equally invented, but a different relationship with Egypt. So maybe you could just say a bit more about that, because I'm sure it is more complex than you've had time to tell us. Then again, I wondered if actually you could just say a little bit more about this issue of restitution and appropriation. I mean, I have there a very straightforward question, but obviously you should say more about why there hasn't been more of a kind of campaign for restitution, or if there has been, because maybe there has been and I don't know, why it hasn't been more successful. So why is it still in Berlin? Particularly since my understanding is the German government has been quite, how do you say, advanced, quite willing in other cases to consider the issue of restitution. Yeah, I mean, I think there was, I think that's probably all I want to say for now. No, except I have one other question, which is huge. So you know, you can. Okay, I do. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. No, that makes a lot of sense. Go for it. Perfect. Perfect. Exactly. Perfect.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Lucy. That was great. Thanks for the response and also your thoughts, and also for the invitation to talk a little more about some of the complexities here. Yeah. So let me start with the first question. You're right. I mean, you know, given the time, this is a book condensed into 20 minutes, so a lot came across as really schematic, which it wasn't. So yes, I would say that, so from the very beginning, there is a contestation of her, you know, of Nefertiti's belonging to the European tradition, particularly among African Americans, who don't really have, you know, they're not heard as they are heard now when Beyonce and Rihanna, you know, say something that already people like W.E.B. Du Bois or people in the Harlem Renaissance more generally would say. I mean, someone like Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, he had a Nefertiti bust in the hallway. Malcolm X, you know, for these people, it was very clear that Egypt was part of their own tradition. So in that sense, we could say that this contestation happened early on, but in the European context, it wasn't much debated, really, mostly because it was. I mean, I would call this it was essentially assumed that a high civilization like the Egyptian one had to be different from anything that Africa had to offer. Therefore, her race, quote unquote, was unmarked, right? It was not even, you didn't have to talk about it, right? It was like, as this is frequently the case. But in terms of complexities and contestations, it's also interesting to see that also within the African American debate, you have very different positions. So many of them, like Du Bois, for example, they would specifically say, white America has appropriated Egypt as white, as an empire, and we need to write against that, and we need to claim Egypt as Black and African. For example, there were, you know, scholars and politicians and so forth who said ancient Egypt declined once they started miscegenation with the slaves. Now, the US after the Civil War is going down the drain exactly like ancient Egypt. So this is the picture they went up against. But it's also important to say that there've always been voices who were critical, right? Because I mean, if you as a strategy of emancipation and liberation, African American strategy, you point to an empire. An empire, first of all, right? And second, one that's built on slavery, that's problematic. So, and you know, just to give you an example, in the case of Nefertiti, so someone like Toni Morrison in the 60s, she says, you know, I understand why you're all infatuated with Nefertiti, but you know, come on, I mean, this woman, she wouldn't have made it, she would have lasted 10 minutes at a gas station, for example, or in a parents' meeting in school. So why do you look for pharaohs and queens? Why do you look at, right? I mean, so there's clearly a class thing here, and this kind of contestation happens from the get-go. So this is a much more complex story. As to the second point, restitution, that's really super interesting. So So Egypt demands restitution 4 months after the first exhibition, that is in October 1924. So in other words, the story of negotiations about restitution are 100 years old, just like Nefertiti really is. And initially, the interesting thing is that in the 1920s, the Germans were quite willing to yield. So the Egyptians offered a statue, say, look, you will get this statue, we'll get Nefertiti, and then all are happy. And the Prussian Minister of Culture, he asked the specialists, he asked the archaeologists, the Egyptologists, what do you think? And almost in unison, they said, do it. You know, the bust looks fancy, the people out on the street like it, but from an art historical perspective, it's actually not worth very much. So we should, and look, if we don't do this now, people in 50, 60 years, they will look back at us and ridicule us, you know, for being infatuated with this object. So that's very interesting. And in June 1930, we have German newspapers, you know, with the heading, you know, sort of goodbye Nefertiti, you know, it's being returned. So that was a done deal. And only at the last minute, because of popular uproar, was it actually stopped. The same thing happened again in 1933, and it was ultimately only Adolf Hitler himself who stopped. So these were two moments. The negotiations begin again in the 1950s. There's an interesting moment in 1952 when the Germans, they have the so-called Luxembourg Treaty, which is a sort of a, you know, it's a treaty with Israel to make up for everything, right? The Holocaust, ultimately. So it dedicates a lot of money to Israel, and all the Arab countries become enraged. And at this moment, there are memos circulating within the Foreign Office claiming, let's restitute Nefertiti, you know, to sort of calm the waters. Well, anyway, this doesn't happen ultimately. And today, I mean, just to conclude this discussion, today, the demands are still on the table all the time. They're not made officially by the government. They're typically made by people like Zahi Hawass, so meaning people in official positions, but not necessarily with the government itself. So the German side essentially says, look, there's no official demand for restitution, so there's no need to do anything. And it's going to be very, very difficult to wrest that statue from the German museum. I wonder if I live to see it, is my prediction.
Okay, so I don't know, Lucy, whether you want to go on to your question or, well, because I also have something to raise.
I have a question, but I can ask another time. So why don't you go ahead now, please?
Yeah, well, okay, if you don't mind. I actually have, so, you know, in 1992, when I first visited Berlin, immediately sort of a few years after the fall of the wall, one of the first places that we went to was Charlottenburg to look at Nefertiti's head. So it's kind of, it's been this thing which I always wanted to see. And if possible, every time I go to Berlin, I try to see it, you know, since then. So obviously, it's got incredible kind of hold on people's imagination. And so I kind of want to talk at the very basic level about visuality of Nefertiti and the absolute importance of her beauty, or at least what we see in the statue, in the bust, that is supposed to represent her. Because we actually don't know whether she was like that, right? I mean, we assume she must be close to that. But in the olden days, they always made statues much more beautiful than the actual person. So you just kind of assume that maybe she's not as beautiful, possibly, as the statue, but she must have been a very, as the bust, but she must have been a very beautiful woman anyway. And so it's this, you know, this thing about visuality, because when you think about all this, you know, the global icon element of your talk and your research, which is very striking, is that Nefertiti is Nefertiti to everybody. Like, it's not just, okay, Egyptians say, yes, she's actually us and us alone. And you can understand that, right, from an Egyptian's point of view. But you kind of think Germans thought that Nefertiti was a Berliner. I love that kind of thing that you had in your article. And everybody else thinks Nefertiti belongs to her. And I also sort of remembered in conjunction with what you just said about, you know, even later in the post-war period when the Americans sort of appropriated Egyptian civilization as a, let's say, a white civilization. What immediately reminded me was my first year history class as an undergraduate in Canada, that I took the history of Western civilization, and the first thing was the Egyptian civilization. And you think, why? You know, so obviously there's a lot going on, right, in this very complex 20th century world, because so much could actually, there was much more transferability of this kind of iconic figure. And so do you actually think, I mean, because you don't actually, in your presentation, you don't actually talk very much about the visualness itself and the importance that imparts in, to everybody else who's looking at this statue, which is that the thing about the visual nature is that it is inherently ambiguous. And so this is why she can be white, she can be black, she can be Afro-Brazilian, she can be, whatever. She can even be in the hieroglyphics of the Chinese kind of, origins of their characters coming from hieroglyphics. So what is it? I mean, how important is actually the visuality? Because your story involves a lot of very interesting kind of intellectual, political, social history behind the rise of this Nefertiti cult almost. But what is it, do you think, that made her sort of representation that important? And yeah, okay, Lucy, you want to come? Yeah, because Garibaldi and everything.
Actually, not at all, because in fact it had been my question too. So I wanted to check it was exactly the question.
Sure.
So but mine is a very short addendum, which was what would an art historian say about this bust? As you said that the archaeologists said, send it back. It'll be an embarrassment. So I wanted to know about its artistic value. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Super interesting question. Now, I mean, I said the archaeologists in the 20s, right? So this would be different today. I mean, I can't imagine any Egyptologist today who would come to the same conclusion. Yeah, and I certainly don't want to deny the aesthetic, quality and the impact also that this bust has on viewers. I don't want to deny that, and but probably, I mean, hundreds of books have been written from an art historical perspective. My own position here would be this. I think, Naoko, when you walk into the new museum in Berlin and you see this bust and think, oh, how beautiful, then you are ultimately already a product of the story that I'm telling. It's, in other words, we are all coded. The bust is coded in this particular way. So when we walk in, we are already prepared to see this as beautiful. And so, in other words, I feel we need to historicize, and by historicize, I mean, we need to look at the moment when this bust becomes this global icon. Again, this is the 1920s. This is Greta Garbo time. It's not, so let's say someone like Rubens or Botticelli would have probably not thought that this was the ideal person to paint. So it comes at fortuitously at the right moment. But there's a second dimension to it. It is discovered by Europeans. It's exhibited in Europe at the height of imperialism, right? After all, I mean, Germany had lost its colonies, but Europe was. The 20s are still the height of European imperialism, which means that an image that is seen and representative of as representative of beauty can circulate in all around the world. So yeah, this is a little speculative now, but my claim, I guess, would be that had Nefertiti been uncovered 200 years earlier, the story might have been very different. Also, Had it been discovered by Egyptians and landed in an Egyptian museum, it may be now one of the many, many, many wonderful objects in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, but not that same iconic figure. So I think we need to historicize what we today experience as an almost universal beauty, right? Because as you say, it speaks to so many different people, but I think it does so only as the result of this history.
Okay, so it's really this kind of historical confluence of so many different factors, isn't it? That made the making of the icon of Nefertiti that much more potent. Because I did think that when you put that image of Greta Garbo, and also Greta Garbo, I don't know whether she played this before or after, but she was Queen Christina of, so in fact, Garbo figure is very strongly associated with the strong kind of Nordic queen, Swedish queen. And I just kind of like it all sort of comes in together for me. I can see that there was that moment that captures the imagination, because it is also the moment of when the empire is still just there, and appropriation of Egyptian civilization through Nefertiti is kind of something that I can easily imagine happening, because also in the late 19th century too, that there was quite a lot of European explorations of archaeological excavations going on around the world, and in Central Asia and lots of different parts of the world. And of course, Berlin has another fantastic museum, Pergamon, which has that Babylonian gate and all sorts of things. So it's that. I think what you're saying is that it was actually the product of the time that also grew in a way even bigger than how it was in the beginning, right, throughout the 20th century.
I mean, I would also say that, and I think you're alluding to that, I mean, this is also clearly the moment, the age of photography and then also film, right? So this is, I mean, there's clearly a media history. I mean, without the media history behind this, the whole story would not have been possible. So, again, speculative, but if the bust had been found, let's say 100 years earlier, where the image just couldn't have been disseminated so quickly, so widely, so thoroughly, maybe it would just be another object. And really, I recall walking through the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and thinking, why isn't this piece or this statue as famous? Because I don't think it is in the object itself, right, that we can discern the power that it has. It's really the history. And there's maybe one more thing that, I mean, think also of of Tutankhamun. His grave was discovered just 2 years before Nefertiti was exhibited for the first time. It's exactly the same moment. And again, Times projected her image, the Times around the world. It's that moment of where photography, yeah, it's so incredibly powerful. But there's one more thing, which is we simply don't know much about Nefertiti as a figure, as an ancient, as an individual. We don't know very much. So it is very easy to project virtually anything onto her. And I'm not saying that that's key, but that's sort of, I think, an added dimension that actually makes it really easy for very different interest groups to use her for their purposes. And that, I think, that added to the power. The more, it's very interesting. I read this piece in the Journal of the Nation of Islam, where they say, now, given that Nefertiti is so well known, then this and this and this. In other words, they assume the popularity and then say, now we use it for our purposes. Adding the next layer, which again, it's sort of a reinforcing circle. Every new appropriation makes her more famous, and given that she's even more famous, it's worth actually adding her to your own agenda. So yeah, so that's, I think, the mechanism that is at play here.
Okay, so I don't know, Lucy, do you want to respond? Are you okay? Okay, so we're gonna spend the last few minutes going to the questions. So the first one is, how did the husband of Nefertiti become the first monotheist idealist in an individual? What do you mean by idealist?
Thank you. Yeah, idealist is the term that was not mine, but it was James Breasted, this American Egyptologist. The idea of the individual essentially comes through the artwork of the Amarna period. So the idea was that up until then, human figures were depicted schematically more as types, not as individuals. And according to the art historians of the early 20th century, this was the difference with the art of the Amarna period, meaning the period of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Amarna is this capital that survives only about 15 years, right? As soon as they die, it vanishes completely. The capital is shifted back to Thebes. But the art of this period, according to the art historians of the time, depicted individuals or humans as individuals with particular features close to life in a naturalistic, realistic way. So that was seen as particularly individualizing, but also seen as modern, right? So that's what's behind the statement, that quote. Thank you.
Okay, so we have another question here. Whether she is white or black, did Moses play any role in it?
Yeah, Moses. Yeah, no. The quick answer is no. It is only Sigmund Freud who inserts Moses into the story, right? He feels that, or he reads the Akhenaten story into the story of Moses, who, according to him, was, influenced by this revolution and then brought it to what is today, to Palestine, Israel. So that is a fiction.
Okay, so can I just ask you about, have you presented this idea or the book in Egypt? I just wondered what kind of reception, whether you had any opportunity to do that.
Thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, my first opportunity would have come up in November, but I had already all kinds of other commitments, so I couldn't go. What I know is that the Arab translation of the book that will come out in Egypt is supposed to come out still this year. So it would be super interesting to see what the reception is like. Absolutely, yeah. It's very obvious that whenever you travel to Egypt, Nefertiti is in Berlin. The bust is in Berlin, but Nefertiti is with you everywhere you go. Even on the plane, you're handed the immigration card, and it's already an image of Nefertiti that you'll then have to fill out. So it's ever present. It's clear that there will be reactions, I'm sure, and of course it would be wonderful for me to be in touch with and exchange with Egyptian scholars about this. Yeah.
I mean, I just kind of wonder, as we just got 2 more minutes, does this bear any comparisons, Lucy, with the work that you did? Fantastic book you written on Garibaldi, because he's like, because I kind of thought that, for example, I was actually quite, in a way, surprised by how powerful impact he had visually on the women of the, of the period. And so it's again going back to that question of like the aesthetics, of it, or and how much is it that's sort of affecting people's perceptions of these icons, should we say?
I mean, I think we've got very little time, so I'll be
really
quick,
very
which is quite fun, right?
Very quick.
I think that there's a major difference, and that's why I stressed cultural artifact at the beginning. There's a major difference because this is a living person and not an artifact. So certainly during Garibaldi's lifetime, it's a more complicated story. But after his death, yes, exactly the same process really takes place. Exactly that kind of possibility of manipulation of left and right and so on, that does take place. So there is a more general discussion to be had about fame and the control of fame. Yeah.
Okay.
Che Guevara comes to mind also as an image where you could tell an interesting and in some ways parallel or similar story.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we have to end our discussion here today. And so we haven't been able to get back to Harumi Goto Shibata's question, but we hope we're going to have another opportunity in another format. So thank you so much to Sebastian CONRAD for this brilliant presentation, and for Lucy RIALL for, fantastic comments. And thank you to the audience for listening in and for your questions. So to the next webinar. See you anon, I guess. Okay, bye. Thank you.